I do strongly believe that cars are, and it's not belief, it's a fact that cars are just a atrociously inefficient way to move human bodies in very dense city areas. It's just a scientific fact. You don't need 2 tons of metal to move a 70 kilo of human body. You can have the exact same efficiency or the same effect with very light vehicles that take a lot less space, that consume a lot fewer resources. As the cities make it easier to cycle and harder to drive cars or vans around, the unit economics of using those kind of transportation modes, especially for logistics, are going to become so much more favorable, because you see the capex is much lower and the cost of running it is much lower as well. If on top of that it's faster, then the switch could happen very, very quickly. But then again, that goes back to the infrastructure. Like, the cities have a role in making that happen.
Hello, I'm your host, Mike Gelb, and this is the Consumer VC Podcast, where we discuss the intersection of venture capital and consumer innovation. If you're enjoying this show, also subscribe to my newsletter at theconsumervc.com, where you'll receive new episodes straight to your inbox and a weekly recap of all the consumer deals that are happening. If you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying it. If it's on Apple and Podcasts, please also write us a review. Every review really helps. All content and episodes are for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not investment advice. Our guest today is Martin Mignot, partner at Index Ventures. Index Ventures is a global firm that operates as one team across 3 offices, London, San Francisco, and New York City, and invests at all stages. Martin opened Index's office in New York a few years ago, and we discussed the massive consumer opportunity in New York that Index has tapped into, the future of transportation and delivery, which Martin is really passionate about, and the differences Martin sees between European and American consumer markets. Without further ado, here's Martin. Martin, thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you?
Very well. Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate you taking the time. So I know that you've invested a lot on Europe, and I know that Index started off as a European, or is a majority European-based fund. You're based in New York. I know you do a lot of also work here in the US. What's the difference in your mind from a consumer market standpoint, and maybe just from a venture capital startup standpoint, between the US and the European markets?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to go back first on how you described Index. So it is true, we started in Europe, started in Geneva, of all places, more than 25 years ago. Then opened an office in London, and then 10 years ago an office in San Francisco, and then last year an office in New York. So kind of every 10 years we kind of open up a new office, pretty much. I don't know where the next one will be. It is still TBD. But we're quite deliberate when we open a new office. And today we're very much basically a transatlantic fund. So we got half of our team in the US, half of our team in Europe, but we invest from the same fund across geographies, and with the same team. So we really work as one team across the Atlantic. And that's kind of what the move to go to New York was about. We wanted to have one partner from London and one partner from San Francisco to make sure that New York would be that bridge and that place where both kind of continents can meet. And that's a little bit how I see New York, like not as a fully American city. I don't know, it may be blasphemous to say that, but I don't feel so much like, well, I mean, technically Manhattan is an island, right? We're not quite on the American continent. Right? So it's closer to Iceland than kind of in topography than as from the American continent. But joke aside, we do at least personally, I do see New York as a bit of a hybrid between the two worlds. There's a huge immigrant community, obviously. Half of tech workers in New York are immigrants. There's a very big European community. I'm kind of animating and organizing a community. We've got about 150 venture-backed European entrepreneurs based in New York or about to move here, So it's a very vibrant, very kind of global scene, much more than the purely American scene. I find that's kind of that was the attraction for me, and that's also the attraction for Index because that's very much what we're about. In terms of consumer markets, to go back to your second question, I mean, the obvious thing, which is still kind of really blowing my mind, is the depth of the market is so different. I think when you invest in a lot of European consumer companies, they have to have a kind of a multi-local approach where markets are very fragmented. Even though there is the eurozone and you may be having the same currency, the consumer preference, some of the payment methods may be different, some of the regulations may still be different. The market structure will be different. You will have different set of incumbents, different types of competing offering, and so you are always you start with one market and you're always thinking about, okay, where to go next, what's the most attractive market, and it takes time and effort. And if you add up all of these individual markets together, you get kind of to roughly the same size as the US, which you can kind of attack in one go when you're here. So the kind of growth rate that you see here on the consumer side, there's just pretty much no company in Europe can reach those numbers, simply because the depth of these individual markets is just so much less so than in the US.
Appreciate that. Appreciate you giving us a little bit about the distinction. New York City has always been global. Right? It's also always been an island. At least Manhattan. But why was last year the right time in Index's mind to open an office in New York?
The first one is the ecosystem has grown tremendously, and we've been investing in New York for a very long time. Actually, we were the first investors in Datadog, and then we were investors in Squarespace and in Etsy and in Cockroach and JustWorks. So a lot of New York has actually been one of our most successful geography ever. So it's not a new area of focus. We just felt like the scale of it had become so significant that we had to have someone on the ground to meet these entrepreneurs first and in person, and really be much closer. So if you look, I think in Q1, the number of early stage deals financed in New York was roughly the same or even slightly more than in San Francisco. So there's been a really, I think the ecosystem is it's still smaller, but I think it's not that much smaller versus what it was just kind of 5 or 10 years ago. The second aspect is what I was referring to on the diaspora. We a lot of our work, and we've published a couple of books about helping European entrepreneurs expand to the US and helping US entrepreneurs expand to Europe. I think being kind of in the middle of those two continents, you attract a lot of foreign entrepreneurs, and you also find US entrepreneurs who are very globally minded, and typically have a big focus on European expansion, which has been one of my surprises. I didn't really expect that part of our value proposition to resonate so much so early on. But actually, especially in New York, you have folks who have usually very deep ties to Europe and understand that the European consumer market is, taken as an aggregate, is a very large and very significant market. And also, and similarly for software, a lot of software companies will have 20 to 30% of their revenue at scale coming from Europe. So it's a very significant market, and I think that position as a bridge is what's been extremely important, both for entrepreneurs and also, as I was pointing out, internally. I think internally, being in New York, I can be on a deal flow meeting, a European deal flow meeting in the morning, earlier than I would like to, arguably, but I can still do it, and I can be on a US deal flow meeting in the afternoon, and really have that kind of global view of the market, which is impossible to have if you are either in London or San Francisco, and that's really kind of bringing that global team together.
When you were surprised that as a value prop for US companies that of course, you have a lot of ties to Europe, and of course the firm's roots is in Europe, that European expansion would it be where were typically US entrepreneurs when they were thinking about international expansion, what would be like the first market outside the US that they would typically go to?
I mean, London, obviously it varies widely depending on the type of go to market. If it's pure consumer, if it's SaaS or otherwise. But the I mean, London was always the obvious bridge because of language, because of proximity. You have a lot of Americans who have spent or are spending a lot of time in London, may even have family ties, and so that's usually the first stop. It has been changing, a little bit with Brexit, obviously. Now, like if you are, let's say, selling a consumer a good product, well, the eurozone is a much more attractive. It's a much larger and wealthier to a large extent market than the UK market, and you can address it much more easily from places like Amsterdam. Amsterdam is a great city for many reasons: tax, kind of distribution, logistics. And so that would be probably much more logical place to if you have a consumer product company, that's probably a much more logical place to be versus London. Similarly, obviously, Ireland has been a very attractive place. Lots of the large US software companies have set up shop in Dublin, mostly for tax reasons in the first place, but now increasingly for talent, because because now you have these headquarters and you have this talent both on the dev side, especially on the go to market side, and you can hire really good talent there.
Those are all really great points in terms of how like entrepreneurs are thinking about international expansion and why some markets might be better as a first market versus others. And I understand kind of the wrench too that Brexit has thrown into it when thinking about these topics. I wanted to also ask you a bit about urban transportation and the future of urban transportation. I know that when I think about the future of urban transportation, I think I immediately think of the Segway, right? And where Steve Jobs predicted the Segway would become as big as the PC, and Jeff Bezos and a lot of tech titans were very, very excited by the launch, and never really turned out that way. I think it actually was discontinued last year, even though I know that some of the Segway technology was used in scooters and other transportation applications. And I know in 2020 you said that next year you will see the first major European to ban private cars. Um, how are you thinking about today? First of all, did that actually happen? Did a major European city have they banned private cars yet? And how are you thinking about the future of urban transportation?
No, it hasn't happened quite yet. I mean, there are some smaller cities that have done it. On the larger scale, Paris is in the process of banning most of the traffic from the more central arrondissement, which is the size of it's probably a few 100,000 inhabitants that are covered by that. So that's a first step. They haven't expanded that to the entirety of Paris, but I think it's just a matter of time. So I was too optimistic, but I think I'm still right, kind of directionally, which I think happens fairly often, unfortunately. And as you know, in investing, it's all about timing. So sometimes I tend to be a little bit too early. This is the future of cities for sure. I think cars. And again, I mean, that's a topic that's very, very close to my heart. So I'm talking here almost as much as an activist, as an investor, and actually that's something that I've learned about, and is try to dissociate your heart and your brain sometimes, and try to be more dispassionate when making investments. Is a better way to make money. But as an individual, really passionate about it, I do strongly believe that cars are, and it's not belief, it's a fact that cars are just a atrociously inefficient way to move human bodies in very dense city areas. It's just a scientific fact. You don't need 2 tons of metal to move a 70 kilo of human body. You can have the exact same efficiency or the same effect with very light vehicles that take a lot less space, that consume a lot fewer resources, and in cities, space is everything. When if you think about those dense big cities, the price of a square foot, and there's no reason why we should optimize for the least efficient way of transport on a square foot basis, right? So I think it's just a matter of time that city fully realize that, recognize it, and reorganize around it, and that space is made much more difficult and much scarcer for especially the individual cars. So in terms of new technologies that are enabling that, I think the electric scooter is, if you think about the hierarchy of transport, I think walking is gonna, is obviously is always gonna remain the biggest one, and the one that we should promote more so by making it just more pleasant and easier. Then in the electric scooter for very short distances, 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes, maybe from or to a transport station, train station or bus station, you can fold it, you can bring it into that bigger mode of transport. And then, electric bikes, and, for slightly longer distances. And one I'm really passionate about is the electric cargo bikes, both for, kind of to replace the family car. I have one of those long tail, and that's how we move around as a family. I can put my two kids and sometimes even my wife as well on it, and some folks have seen me. I also take some of my colleagues, to meetings in New York City, and that always makes a bit of an impression. It's a bit of a rite of passage. If you come to the Index New York office, you will have to be on my long tail, my turn GSD bike at some point. Um, that's an activity people do, and then also for logistics. I think replacing. It's funny now that if I order Amazon Fresh from the Whole Food marketplace, for example, the driver comes in a cargo bike. They have a cargo bike, and they have this huge platform with, like, packs of stacks of crates, and that's how they do the delivery. And that's just incredibly efficient. And so I think as the cities make it easier to cycle and harder to drive cars or vans around, the unit economics of using those kind of transportation modes, especially for logistics, are going to become so much more favorable, because you see the capex is much lower and the cost of running it is much lower as well. If on top of that it's faster, then the switch could happen very, very quickly. But then again, that goes back to the infrastructure. Like, the cities have a role in making that happen.
No, those are excellent points. How thinking about unit economics too for different kind of modes of transportation within urban centers. For example, like how do you think about when a type of like form factor, let's say like a scooter for example, would work in terms of the actual city? Like what are you kind of thinking about when it comes to maybe city density or not? Thinking about like Bird for example, which I know hasn't performed very very well in the public markets, and they pulled out a number of markets because it didn't make sense for them to be in. When you're thinking about investing in new types of companies, how do you think about where it actually could work in a in and the type of city it could actually work, where actually those unit economics make sense?
Yeah, look, I think my experience investing in transportation overall, and I've invested across the board in everything from scooters to e-bikes to carpooling with BlaBlaCar to car sharing with Drivey, which has become kind of get around, to train. I was invested in a company called Captain Train, which became Trainline, which kind of went public. And overall, it hasn't been a great. It's been a very mixed bag. Some fairly big successes, but a lot of failures. And the reality is, there are two challenges. One is, you're competing very often. Well, first of all, you're competing very often with heavily subsidized modes of transport, whether that's public transport, which is great, but also even private transport. The drivers of cars are not charged anywhere near what they cost to society. And so there is a strong disincentive to moving to another mode of transport. And if you think about kind of things like shared scooters, the reality, if you think about them, they're incredible. It's an incredible feat where you have a private company that builds shared, meaning a public mode of transport, which allows anyone in the city to go from point A to point B on their own schedule without owning a vehicle. I mean, it's such a powerful value proposition for the individual, but also for the city. And yet it doesn't require a single dime of kind of public money. It's quite the opposite. They're actually charging these people to operate that way. Even though in any other mode of transportation would be subsidized for being so efficient. And so I think those the economics are really hard to make work on in the shared world. And also you are obviously dealing with hardware and physical goods put in a public setting, which is always going to be a really hard proposition. So the reality, unfortunately, I think in that space is that the winners will be mostly the manufacturers, and there are some big winners. I mean, e-scooters and e-bikes, and there are massive categories, and a lot of them, will be unfortunately, coming from China and Asia more broadly. Taiwan's also a very big manufacturer of bikes and scooters. And I think the local service provider as well as the local brands, I don't think we're going to see massive outcomes, unfortunately. So I do believe that the trend is growing. If you look at the sales number for e-bikes, e-scooters, cargo bikes is kind of through the roof, and that's not so as a consumer phenomenon, that's a win. I mean that's happening, and that's never going to come back. As an investment area and a way to generate outsized return, which is our model as venture funds, it's by nature fragmented, complex, subsidized, public, regulated space, which is very difficult to make these outsized returns in.
I really appreciate that. Especially what I really like about it is thinking about transportation as well. You have to think about subsidized transport. So in terms of what you're competing with when you actually do invest in a transportation company, especially something that's so interesting as like a shared scooter where you actually there's no ownership. You pay as you go as you on it, or it could be even like a shared bike or some type of different transportation. And also, I think as a consumer, what you don't take into account for, as well as I'd imagine, pricing is challenging because we're up against, different options that are subsidized. You're also up against, someone driving you like a private car, like an Uber or a Lyft, and it might actually cost, cheaper, but maybe not as much cheaper as you thought it would be. And at the same time, you're, in the backseat of a car. But what isn't getting priced in that side, as you said, was pollution, was kind of all the environmental effects that you actually get in. And so, but from a consumer's perspective, you may not be thinking about that. You might just be thinking, oh well, driving a bike or renting a bike or renting a scooter, it's a little cheaper, but really not that much cheaper than going an Uber. I'm going to take the Uber as in going to bike sharing. And then you factor into too that you have to charge these things, right? How are you going to do that, and all the kind of intensity that goes into that. So I can understand why. Obviously, it's a pretty tough model to make work and to make right, because you have all these different factors, which I really appreciate you saying. And what I'm always curious about is that that's part of why venture capitalists invest in maybe these types of products, and that they're hard to build, they're hard to get right, especially when you're dealing with hardware and software component, right? How do you think, from this point, do you think about the challenge of a business model and analyzing the business model? And if the unit economics can actually get right at scale when you're looking at new opportunities?
Yeah, I think what's changed obviously is the cost of capital, right? And that's the one factor, and especially in those type of businesses which are very capital intensive, that's going to be a huge factor. That's why you look at some of these investments that were made in 2019, 2020, 2021, and you look at them today with the lens of an interest rate at north of 5% versus negative interest rate, then obviously some of these investments don't work anymore because you're relying on access to a lot of equity. You may be relying on access to very cheap debt and kind of capital investment financing. And then when those are not available, then obviously those types of models don't work. And so I think now the focus, and I do believe this area of higher inflation and higher rates for longer is upon us. I don't think we're going to revert to negative or zero or negative interest rates like we had in Europe anytime soon. The Bank of England just raised, kept on just raised another half a percent, and so I think we need to be prepared for that. I think entrepreneurs need to be prepared for that. I think for us as investors, that does mean that capital efficiency from the ground up is going to be an extremely, is going to be a very, it's always an important factor, but way more important when capital is expensive. And so if you look at the field of transportation, that means either pure software plays or models with so either pure software, so kind of fleet management or battery management, or plays with very strong network effects where you can drive and build liquidity without necessarily or at least where you would have a really strong advantage at large scale, and where you could finance that growth because you have a lot of clarity around your gross margin and the lifetime value of the customers you're acquiring. So I think it just brings a lot more discipline, and in that field there aren't many companies that kind of are obvious candidates on either of those dimensions right now. But it may change.
How do you define, because I know that you invest primarily, I believe, in seed. How do you define seed today?
Yeah, so we actually invest. So we do have a seed fund, $300 million seed fund, which it's true, is where we spend a lot of our time and a lot of our activity because we want to invest as early as possible, and we love being the first investor. We love working with the entrepreneurs in the early days to really shape their vision and shape their team and shape their product, and so we really enjoy that. But we also have a venture fund, which is $800 million, and we also have a growth fund of $2 billion. So we are really a multi-stage fund, but our particularity is it's the same team working across funds. And we always bring an early stage kind of lens even on growth. We always bring an early stage lens to it. And we really, think about the upside much more than being kind of precise and downside protection kind of mode. Seed today, like, what's interesting is you have a bit of a kind of tale of two markets where you have where you have AI on one hand, and then everything else on the other hand, which have slightly different dynamics. And so even though I think AI, interestingly, is actually is very quickly not turning into a sector anymore, a domain anymore, and it's just becoming it's like saying, oh, I'm a cloud company, or I'm a mobile company. That everything is a cloud or a mobile company. And I think very quickly we're turning into a world where everything is an AI company. You just part of the stack that you build on, and that's part of the feature that you can build and that you can offer to your customer. So I think that's even that classification is almost already becoming redundant. And so, but for these type of companies, what we're seeing is for the right teams, and the right teams are typically not so much the AI researchers, although that's a theme as well, and there are still companies focusing on fundamental AI research that are being funded. Most of these teams today are much more similar to the more traditional team where you have entrepreneurs with very deep domain knowledge or very unique insight about the category, and but also the ability to build product and having their team software engineers that know how to integrate the latest kind of cutting edge technology, which today increasingly means bringing the latest development in AI in AI models, and in the future may involve bringing the Apple Vision Pro and more things around kind of AR and VR, integrating those. But I think we are past the stage, and so the we're really trying to find these highly user centric entrepreneurs who really start from the we're not like, oh, I've got this cool technology and I'm going to use it for X, but go the other way around and start from, I know this customer, I know this market, I know there is need. And actually, it turns out that this new piece of technology is going to help me solve that need in a way that wasn't possible, a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. And that's why it hasn't worked before, because obviously it will have been tried. There's always that question, but then here is why. If you're an entrepreneur, that should be a very important slide in your deck, which is why has it failed before and why is it not going to fail this time around. And so that's kind of what those are the entrepreneurs we're looking for. And then in terms of the deal terms, it varies very widely based on the caliber of the team and how much they've proven. But we typically see kind of a typical seed today is going to be around 5 million, and 20, 25, and sometimes 30 valuation for the very, very hot deals. I mean, that's pretty much kind of the I would say the YC kind of standard terms these days.
Okay. No, I appreciate. That's great insight. Great insight. And I mean, how do you also operate just being a multi-stage fund and and there's not everyone seems kind of in terms of their stage like generalists per se in terms of they interact with founders maybe as they as the companies grow and you kind of stay on with those companies, but how do you think about being a multi-stage fund and not being like a single stage fund, and because also some of like the pushback maybe from founders that maybe don't want to partner with a multi-stage fund is if that fund ends up not following on, what that actually could mean to the rest of the market, and then maybe they're actually become stuck and not able to not able to fundraise, not able to grow. So overall, how do you think about your overall pro rata strategy as well?
Yeah, it's a very valid kind of question and concern that we obviously hear all the time. And I said there is some there's some truth to it. But in my experience, and I've been doing this for almost 14 years now, so I've seen quite a few of those. And it's never really been a problem in reality. The problem typically is because you've got two scenarios, right? You're either doing well and you're a hot company, and then like we want to follow on, but the problem is more like everybody else wants to invest as well, and so you're in a pickle to pick someone, and there's a fight for allocation, or you're not doing so well, and then we probably won't want to lead, but not many people want to lead anywhere. And actually, having someone like Index, having our brand is a huge is a huge positive. And I do think it's a net positive, even when you include the signaling risk, because every single piece of research on VC performance has proven that if you want to build an algorithm to pick the next best company, the single largest predictor, and you can read all of the research, the academic research on the topic. If you were to pick only one criteria, what would it be? It would be who invested before. And so all of these models and all of these growth funds, all of these algo funds are building, they're all based on one thing, like, okay, what did Index and Sequoia and Axel and so on invest in at seed? That's pretty much the algo. I'm not sure you need an algo to do that, but that's usually the conclusion of these papers. And so this is actually, which shows you, and everyone knows it. And so with all of the growth funds, what they're doing, they are looking at, okay, what are which seed companies have these folks invested in, and they're all going to be at the very top of the list versus not. So already just having someone like us on your cap table very early on totally separates you from the rest of the startup world and gives you a massive leg up and a massive advantage in terms of getting like graduating to Series A and then above. After that, yes, if you don't perform, that's not going to solve. That's not a silver bullet by any stretch of the imagination. It's still bloody hard to go from C to Series A, Series B, and Series C. That's it's a struggle for every single company. But I actually do think it gives you a big leg up.
How overall, when you think about when a new kind of industry maybe or sector pops and you see the hype cycle kind of begin to happen, how are you assessing that market?
This is the critical question in this industry because timing is everything. Interestingly, and we don't want to time the market because we're investing so far out. But whether you can see these trends and play them right is just so important. And if you look at Carlota Perez's work on kind of the innovation cycle, um, I think what's tricky is that every disruptive innovation will create a phase of frenzy. There is going to be a phase of frenzy that is going to happen, and you look at the railroad story. Is a very good example of that, and and folks lost insane amount of money, in investing in railroads. Um, and actually, it turned out railroads was a fantastic innovation and a long-lasting innovation. And we're still taking trains, and it was real. It was a real thing. It's just that you had this phase of frenzy, which kind of really helps to install and democratize and industrialize a piece of technology. And so when you invest in that bubble is an important one. But the problem is the reverse isn't true. It's not because you have a feeding frenzy that it is going to be a disruptive innovation that is going to be long lasting. So very often people can mistake that frenzy for, okay, oh, there's a frenzy, so there's a hype cycle, so then there's going to be the truth, and then the truth, and then there's going to be a plateau, and then a maturation of technology. Sometimes just sometimes you're in the tulip phenomenon where like tulips are great, but they are not disruptive technology. And so, and they're beautiful, but that doesn't really unrelated to the bubble frenzy that happened. And so that's why we always go back to the end user and the use case, and that's our North Star, and that's why we didn't do pretty much anything in crypto, because we looked at it. We bought Bitcoin, and we had someone focused on looking at all of the crypto deals, and we did the work, and we studied in depth, and we met a lot of companies, and obviously that's what we were paid for. um and but we couldn't find a lot of really interesting use cases with a lot of user adoption and thing. We thought, okay, this is 10x cheaper, 10x faster, 10x more convenient. And Bitcoin have some really interesting attributes, and I think that's that's a disruptive technology that is going to have some usage. But a lot of the companies built around and a lot of the derivatives of it, we didn't really, see that. I was on the board of Revolut for many years, and we're seed investors in the company. And the whole point of, but you can transfer money in an instant and for free. Well, Revolut does that, and Venmo does that, and Cash App does that, and Zelle does that, and there are like 20 ways to do that already. So that if that's the value prop, that's not that's not going to work, right? So it has to be more than that. I think with with AI, I think what's interesting is that actually we're organizing an event yesterday on that very topic on the applied AI space, and really we brought together 50 people who are implementing AI in their organization, so startups, corporates, and sharing how they're using it, what use cases, what are the best practices, what are they seeing as results in terms of and that can be to increase revenue, it can be to reduce costs, it can be to improve the user experience. and the truth is, there are quite a few real use cases that are emerging and that people are actually deploying. How impactful those are is still early. The reality is, in that group, there was no one that said, "Well, we've done this," and apart from, I guess, developer productivity, especially the Copilot product. I think that's by far the most successful product out there that uses AI of that new generation, where clearly everyone is pretty much using it, and they are now kind of moving it into kind of functional testing, and so that piece is today one of the only live example of LLM use at scale and with real productivity impact for companies. Outside of that, there's some interesting early signals, but it's still a little bit early, early to say. But we do build, we are seeing the fact we are seeing these use cases, and we are seeing companies being interested in trying it out and deploying it and seeing some usage from their users, give us quite a lot of confidence that there is, this is a long lasting, kind of technological shift. Having said that, that was my earlier point. It is very quickly going to become part of the fabric of every every application and every service, and both for new startups, also for existing startups. And so it's going to be we're going to very quickly revert back to, yes, you need to build and invest in some infrastructure around it, but then at the end of the day, most of the investments will be around the application sphere. And exactly, and that's all going to be, again, to understanding. It's going to be how well do you understand your customers, and how good you are devising a product and a solution that really solves their problem.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I was talking with I had James Courier on the podcast, and we did our episode, I think, all about AI, and he was saying the same thing when what he believes on the application side versus the infrastructure, because what he was saying is when it comes to the human eye, like as we get Chat GPT-4 and 5 and 6, when it comes to the human eye and the human mind, we're not eventually going to be able to tell the difference between, as we get more and more and more advanced with the models and the models and models. At least we're gonna get a point where, like, this is kind of good enough, or this is all we can kind of intake. And so, and like the open source version of that, even if it's not 100%, as per 100% perfect, if it's only 90% perfect, we might not even be able to tell on the infrastructure side with that model. And so the opportunity is not, keep building the infrastructure. It's much more on the application layer and what you can actually do with it.
Yeah, and by the way, this is not even in the future. It's already happening. So we had we had a chat, with a very large CTO of a very large, one of the largest kind of tech companies, not one of the FANG, but kind of just the level down, and they are launching their kind of chat assistant concierge service. And when we ask them, okay, what are you using? What kind of infrastructure are you using? They're like, well, we're using a cloud provider service, and they have an LLM offering, and it may not be the best one, but actually don't really care. It's just that it's part of the my all of my data is on their cloud, all of my instances run there. My entire setup is built around their technology and their stack, and they have something that works well enough for what I want to do. Why would I start going around and tinker with something else? Exactly. So, and they're offering it as in cost wise, they kind of bundle it with the the overall cloud platform cost. So I don't even really see the cost impact, which I thought was a really interesting trend around kind of how quickly these seem to be commoditizing.
Are there any trends that you still think, maybe apart from AI? Because I mean, obviously, the funny part about AI is that it's applicable to a lot of different categories, as you were saying. Like, it's not just one type of category, and that a lot of companies are going to even move into how to and be thinking about how they can be incorporating AI. But is there maybe a particular use case that you still think, and this is maybe outside of AI, or use case or category that you believe right now investors maybe don't know or are bearish on? Because as you said earlier, at the seed stage, at the early stages, you have to be so forward thinking about what's going to be in the future. Um, what is maybe like a particular category or a use case that you're quite interested right now that you don't see others being as focused on?
It's a very good question. I think there's one area, and here I bring more of a growth stage kind of lens on, but I always try to look at market sizes, and because that's how that's a very big indicator of the size. And we have 3 billion that we're investing right now, so we are looking for the very big outcomes. And if you look at, so I always look at how do people actually spend money, what do they really spend money on, and the number one item, obviously, in the budget is housing, accommodation. And for younger people, it's rent. Um, and typically, a second one, the close second, is going to be around healthcare, especially in the US. And I still do think that these two areas have been left pretty much untouched, where it's still, you don't really have any kind of consumer grade experience on those two areas. So I've been looking and making a bunch of investment in the prop tech space, trying to find the right angle to capture some of that rent payment, trying to reduce it, and or to improve the experience, or just change that. It's not clear that it's like it's probably as much of a policy. And again, it's a bit similar to transport, where it's very obvious that it's the single biggest pain point for the young generation. I think that much is clear. Especially whenever you want to move to large cities, which is where most of the interesting jobs are, still this is like a massive tax on young people. So in terms of size and acuity of the problem, that's as big as it gets. And so I am dreaming to find a company that can solve that problem, or at least mitigate it and make it better. Unfortunately, it may be that this is a policy problem. Like transport, it is a policy problem much more than a startup problem. And sometimes you have to, put your hand up and say, well, that's, entrepreneurs are very, they are very creative, but at the end of the day, some things are left to the state. I think on healthcare, I think that's an area where I do, especially in the US market, where, consumers need, could be offered much, much better, kind of much better experiences. And that's also one where I think AI has going to have a big, big role to play. And when, in terms of whether it's choosing, whether it's, tracking your health, whether it's choosing the right provider, whether it's paying for your health, whether it's being reimbursed, kind of choosing the right insurance plan. I think there's a lot of it's very highly, there's a lot of complex processes, a lot of manual processes, a lot of opacity, a lot of information to ingest and sift through. I think those are all areas where kind of AI and automation, that's what they're best at, right? That's what they're best suited for. And we are seeing some really interesting plays. And actually, interestingly, I think a lot of the consumer companies we see with the biggest traction right now, especially on the kind of marketplace model, especially, or around healthcare in the US, with numbers that we've rarely seen in any kind of other kind of consumer marketplaces before. So I think that's a very, I don't think that's a contrarian view necessarily, but I think that's an area where we see a lot of potential.
That's really exciting. That's really exciting. It makes sense. It makes sense as to how you think about markets and why two of those markets that you feel like there really hasn't been that much innovation on where it actually could be. Martin, thank you so much for your time. I know we're a little bit over. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Really enjoyed it.
And there you have it. It was a pleasure chatting with Martin. Martin, thanks again for coming on the pod. If you are enjoying this podcast, please hit subscribe if you're listening on Spotify. Apple or YouTube. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please write us a review. Every review helps. And feel free to subscribe to the newsletter at theconsumervc.com, where you'll receive all new episodes straight to your inbox and a weekly recap of all the consumer deals that are happening. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.